Welcome to the Leopard Society. This is your host, Renee the Leopard, and
Gabby, I am the Empress.
right, are you still doing the Empress? Okay. And we have with us a phenomenal scholar and writer, Dr. Clyde Ford. For anybody who is interested in an African mythology, if you just even have a little check on Amazon, you'll easily hit his book called The Hero with an African Face. And it was one of the first books I ever read about African mythology, Dr. Ford. And it's one of the books that I've read the most in my life. So I really wanted to have you on, not only because I love your book, but also because you, as a person out of the blue, I emailed you over a year ago when I was kind of debating on whether or not to write my own book. I emailed you and a couple of other people I've admired over the years, their scholarship, and you were the only person out of this cohort of at least like 8 people who emailed me back. And not only did you email me back, you emailed me back with words of encouragement and wisdom. So I needed to interview you just to, first of all, say thank you, as I've said many times, but also since you are somebody who is knowledgeable in this area and willing to talk to me, I wanted to pick your mind as well. So welcome to the Leopard Society, Dr. Ford, and yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Vinay and Gabby. I really appreciate this opportunity. Those very kind words you had to say. I answered you because I really got a sense of your sincerity and interest in this area. And I think the area of myth, in particular African mythology, is something that's very important even today.
Definitely. So let's go into just introductions, because obviously what I said about you was so minuscule as opposed to your, life interests, you're a whole, interesting person, not even just about mythology. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you. First of all, I'm an author of 13 works of fiction and nonfiction that span the gamut from body-mind healing to thrillers featuring African-American characters set in New York City or here in the Pacific Northwest to, as you know, a book on African mythology. So I've really enjoyed the opportunity to be published over the years and to write where my interests are. My last book that was published by HarperCollins 2 years ago was a book entitled Think Black, and it's a memoir. It's the story of my father, who was the first Black software engineer in America. So that's what I do. I am an author, and as I said, it's an opportunity to follow my interest and hopefully to tell some good and important stories, particularly the kinds of stories that we as African Americans need to have told.
Excellent, excellent. So you are an author of many books. I am definitely in the works of getting Think Black. Very interesting, your father's history. But let's focus on you. Tell us, how did you even get into, let's go with writing, but then kind of tell us, how did you get into interest in myth?
Well, my professional training, beyond being a software engineer, which was the job my dad had, my professional training is in psychotherapy, and also I have a 4-year degree in chiropractic medicine. So body-mind healing was a very important part of the work that I did when I was in Richmond. My practice was a body-mind practice. I helped people really integrate both their bodies and their minds in their healing process. And I had a patient who was a very famous writer, an academic writer named David White. And David used to come into my practice and say, Clyde, you have a book inside of you, write. Clyde, you have a book inside of you, write. And so one day, to just kind of shut David up, I wrote. And I really discovered I loved the whole process of taking an idea and trying to put it down on the page and explain it to people in such a way that it might hold some value for them. In terms of mythology, I can't remember the order of the book, but I think The Hero with an African Face is my third or fourth book, somewhere in that realm. And one of the things that I began to realize as a chiropractor and psychotherapist, particularly as a psychotherapist, is that individuals could help you understand where they were in the healing process based on the stories that they told about themselves. And as they began to heal, the stories they told began to change. And in particular, those stories often changed from stories of victimization, the what happened to me stories, to stories of empowerment, which were, yes, that happened, but I can integrate that into who I am and be stronger for it. And as I began to see this over and over again in individuals, it got me thinking that maybe not only did this kind of storytelling have a value on an individual level, but as groups and as a community, something similar might take place. And so I began to ask myself, if we as African Americans had stories to tell, would those stories principally be ones of victimization, or would they be ones of empowerment? And the more I looked around at the time before I wrote the book, the stories that I saw, particularly in our communities, were stories of victimization. Mm-hmm. Now, all of the things that happened to us did happen to us. You can't make any light of slavery. You can't make any light of Jim Crow. You can't make any light of discrimination, of police brutality. All those things happen and still continue to happen. But the question is, how do we deal with it? And so I asked the question, I want to get back to the origins of all that. And the origins of all of that seemed like it might be in Africa. And so I had a simple question in mind, and that is, how did the African societies from which slaves were taken heal from that process? And I asked my friends in academia, hey, what do you know about the stories that African societies told themselves about slaves ripped from their midst, about losing a mother, a father, a brother, a child, a nephew, a fiance? What do you know about the stories they tell? They had to do something with that. And, my friends all said, boy, that's a really good question. Nobody we know has ever asked that before, and it'll be interesting to know. And so I really took it upon myself to try to discover an answer to that question. And that's how I got involved in mythology, is looking at how stories can be healing forces.
Excuse me, I'd like to ask a question. Without divulging too much information from your client's personal level, could you give us an example of how the story changed? You said it changed from victimization to, as a story changed. Could you give us an example of that?
Absolutely. So many of my clients, in fact, maybe really most of them, were adult female survivors of early childhood sexual abuse. Mm-hmm. And so a typical early stage story would be, all of this stuff happened to me. My brother or my father or my uncle, abused me. And that's true. There's no question about it. That was true. And it was a story about how these women were the victimizations of that. That was an early stage story. A late stage story would be, you know what? That stuff happened to me, but they no longer have the power. I have the power. I'm an empowered woman. I can control my destiny. I have the ability to set boundaries and say, who is okay to be with and who is not. And so right there, you see, it was a definite shift where one story is about all that happened to me in a kind of woe is me story. And the other is all that happened to me, but I've used all that and integrated it into myself. And now I'm powerful because of what I went through. I'm not a victim because of what I went through. So that's the kind of shift in story that I heard.
Thank you.
Anything else?
Yeah.
So first of all, that's a major reason why I also asked to interview with you as well, Dr. Ford, because I'm very interested in how you see the practicality of storytelling. And first of all, let's get some ideas defined. Okay, so
Sure.
you've explained it in your book well enough, but also want to see how you grew and shift. What is a myth? What is a story? Are they the same thing? Let's just say that for the public before I ask my questions I sent you.
Sure. Well, let's start with myth because that's a word which really has two very different meanings depending on the context in which it's used. So on one hand, the popular understanding of a myth is something that's absolutely not true. We talk about the myth of a stolen election. It just didn't happen. We talk about the myth of the vaccines, though the vaccines actually help people. So as far as I understand, it's not a myth. It's a truth. Yet we use the word myth to mean things which are patently false. That's one use of the word. And that's not the use of the word myth that I'm talking about here. I'm talking about myth in an older sense of that word, where myth represents eternal truths that often cannot be understood by our rational cognitive ways of thinking. And I'll just give you a really great example. Where do we come from when we're born, and what happens to us when we die? There's no real scientific way to understand those major questions. And so mythology has often been the tools by which we tackle those really large, but really, really important issues. And mythology then gives us a way of apprehending those issues that might make sense. And so myth in that context is not something that's false because we're all born, we're all going to die, but it's an insight into the process of human life, of the larger questions we ask. And that's the context in which I mean myth. If we're going to talk about the difference between myth and story, sometimes that difference is simply in how the listener apprehends what they're hearing. So if you listen to something for simply the entertainment value, you may have missed the deeper message that story is carrying. And if you're only listening to a story at the level of whether you smile or laugh or you're sad, basically how it entertains you, then that story has not moved you into the realm of myth. Myth listens or apprehends a story in the way that it helps you come to terms with very deep, important, and meaningful issues in your life. And that's, I think, a place to start with a definition between myth and story.
That's great. That's great. You want to say anything? Okay. Thank you very much. So we like one thing you said was that myth is something that the rational mind cannot grasp well. And I think that might be my
Yes.
problem. Though I think I'm also, trying to I think I'm striding with it, but I want some practical uses of myth, if that makes sense. Let's go with the first question. Well, the first question I sent you. In your book, you said that myths were healing social stories, stories that heal, right? Social stories that heal.
Sure.
Can you explain like what kind of traumas people are trying to heal with myth? Are like was your example about the rape survivors similar? I chopped that question in half, so I'm gonna ask the rest of the question after you respond to that part.
Sure. Well, let's start with the myth that I found about how African societies healed from slaves taken in their midst, because that's just a perfect example of that.
Yes, it is.
So I was literally strolling through a library one evening, library here at the university where I live, Western Washington University. And in those days, before the internet, we'd go through the stacks and see interesting books. And so I pulled out a book, but as I was pulling out one book, another pulled out from the shelves and fell on the floor. So I said to myself, well, maybe I better look at the one that fell on the floor. And I kid you not, Vinay, I picked up this book and I've turned it open to a myth from the Congo, the Bakongo people, Bakongo, the Bakongo people, which was about healing from slavery. And it just really blew my mind. So I sat on the floor in the library and I read this myth. And here's what the myth said. Now, remember, when we talk about slavery, often we start by saying we were ripped from Africa as people. We went through a horrible Middle Passage. And when we got to the New World, we were subjected to this wretched treatment. How we lived, we were subject to the whip, you name it. All of that is true. But here's what the African myth said. It said that the men and women taken from these societies were actually heroes and heroines who were embarking on this journey over the water to an unknown place that was an island, because nobody, this is way before the internet, we're talking 1500s, 1400s, nobody's ever been across the Atlantic and come back to these African societies and told them what's over there. So these are heroes and heroines who are taking a ship beyond the horizon to this land where there's an island, and when they get to this island, they're going to be subjected to years and years and years of hard physical labor and toil and trials and tribulations. But through that process, they're going to gain this tremendous wisdom and insight, and eventually they are going to return with a gift of knowledge that they can deliver to the societies from which they've come. Now, those are describing the same sets of circumstances in two very different ways. One is to look at those circumstances from the point of view of a victim, and the other is to look at those circumstances from the point of view of being empowered. And that is a great example of how myth and story can and should be, for those that it speaks to, how it can be used in a healing process. And that's how at least the Bakongo people used that myth of slaves taken from them. And I just want, the other thing I think you may know, and if not, I'm certainly glad to say it to you, is that the myths from the Bakongo come from a place in West Africa where most of the early generation of slaves in America came from. So most of the early generation, and by I'd say, the first generation of slaves from 1619 to 1660, most of them came from the Congo-Angola region of West Africa. So this is before there were slaves coming really from Mali and Ghana and even Nigeria. Most of them came from a little further south. And so this is a very deep and an old myth, and one that those slaves who left, and this is really important, the enslaved people who were taken from these societies had and knew this myth. So that meant that they came understanding themselves not as victims, but as heroes and heroines, thrust onto a journey not of their own choosing. And that's also what the myth said. They didn't want to go on this journey, but they were thrust onto it. And yet they were also capable of using that in a way that was personally empowering. I thought that was really powerful. I thought, wow, this might be something which could help us, meaning African Americans, step beyond simply looking at our history as a history of victimization and making it a history of empowerment.
Dr. Ford, thank you very much. First of all, that was near the beginning of your book, and it was one of the most powerful parts of the book, right? Obviously, a whole lot of messages can be received from the book, but the fact of the matter of the idea of a group of people being thrown into the waters, taken from their home, forced on a journey. First of all, that is the hero's journey, right? That's kind of how the heroes rarely ever get to choose to be the hero, right? And not only that, these,
Absolutely.
oh yeah, go on.
No, go ahead.
And not only that, when like the reason I brought you on, quote unquote, is for practical reasons, but I'm a mystic at heart. And not only is this story a story of real practical usage of myth to heal, it's also the internal and eternal and internal story of humanity, right? Going in the water, underground, finding something that is worthwhile to dig up and bring to the surface or back to where you came from. All of this is not only the hero's journey, the mystic's journey, the journey of reuniting and going home after a long battle. Like all of this is, the eternal internal fight, right? So do you have anything to say about that?
Sure. I mean, first of all, I think you're absolutely right. This is how you understand myth beyond just the story. And it is how you apprehend the deeper meaning. For the Bukongo people, the horizon was the separating line between the ordinary consciousness and the deeper unconscious. So when a ship disappeared over the horizon, they considered those souls going into the realm of the unconscious and into the realm of the deeper wisdom of themselves. And so everything you said is certainly what the Bukongo understood by this myth. And that's why I thought it was so important that we resurrected the myth and really try to understand how these kinds of myths could be useful tools, not for everybody, but for some people who really resonate with in terms of healing.
All right. I definitely want to hear what kind of people are not the myth may not help, but let's see, Gabby, you have anything to add?
I do. I have a question. How do the myths that you that are found in your book, Hero with an African Face, how are they comparable to the myths that most Western society are familiar with already, like the Greek myths and the
Indian,
heroes, Indian myths?
Mm-hmm.
How are they comparable? I mean, are they comparable?
Yeah, again, that's a wonderful question. So in part, I wrote the Hero with an African Face because when I picked up the most famous recent work on mythology, Joseph Campbell's The Hero with 1,000 Faces.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
The first line I read in that book was a slap in the face to African mythology. Joseph Campbell said, and this is the first line of the book, the very first line, whether we listen with aloof amusement to the red-eyed mumbo jumbo of some witch doctor from the Congo.
Whoa.
And I said, wait a minute, wait.
First sentence.
Wait, what do you mean? Mumbo jumbo, red-eyed witch doctor. I mean, that was such a racist statement that it seemed as though African mythology had no place, because the rest of that paragraph goes on to extol the virtues of Greek mythology and Hindu mythology and all the other mythology. but African mythology is really left
Right.
out. And so it seemed to me that if Campbell was correct about all these other mythologies, that the truth permeated all these cultures in these beautiful ways, then it had to permeate African culture, but nobody had ever really taken African mythology seriously, including Joseph Campbell. And so that was really, I mean, the answer to your question, Gabby, is that African mythology stands shoulder to shoulder on par with any of the great mythologies of the world. And in some ways, African mythology is probably the origin of many of those mythologies anyway, because we came from Africa. The stories came with us as humanity. And many of the stories we can actually trace back to Africa. So, you know, it's a beautiful understanding to see that African mythology takes second place to no mythology in the world. And again, it stands on its own as an understanding of the world, equivalent to anything you would find in any other culture.
Absolutely, absolutely. And please keep that in mind because I'm going to ask basically the same question in a different way in a little while. Just comparing African mythology to other myths around the world. But you said something a little provocative, saying that myth. You didn't say it. I'm paraphrasing, saying that myth may not be for everybody. You know, can you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I'd be more than happy to. So, and let me just give you an example of who resonates with myths that really surprised me. So when The Hero with an African Face was published, and this is a long time ago, maybe 20 years ago, for the next 10 to 15 years, I regularly got letters. And when I say regularly, I mean once or twice a month from Black men on death row. And I didn't go out to write the book for this reason. But they wrote to me and they said, you know, thank you, Dr. Ford, for writing this book because it helped me come to terms with the circumstances of my life. So I didn't understand why at first. And then I realized that one of the functions, so anyway, I was saying that I got a number of letters from Black men on death row who said thank you for the book because it helped them come to terms with the circumstances of their lives. And that's really the function of mythology. It's to help us come to terms with how our life is to unfold. Now, I had really was not thinking about men on death row who are facing the end of their lives, often for reasons that they're not even have committed the crimes that they have been convicted of. But the fact that story could help them at that critical moment in their life it really touched me quite deeply. And also in the book, I talk about the very real life heroes and heroines that we all have access to and understand and resonate with. And I'm just thinking, for example, of a story that I told that some of these young men, older men would often recite as a means of thanking me was the story of Martin King sitting in a Birmingham jail. And I likened that in the book to the story of a hero or heroine being swallowed by a monster. And the questions that King asked of himself and asked of others based on finding himself sitting in that monster's belly. And I think it's appropriate. I certainly think many people can understand how we as African Americans might look at our history and say, yeah, for years and years, we sat and are still sitting in the belly of the beast. And the question then is, and all of the hero stories from Africa and other places that have the motif of the hero or heroine being swallowed by a beast, even the Bible, Jonah swallowed by a whale. The question is, how do you work your way out of that deep, dark place? And, you know, that's for people that mythology really speaks to. not everybody understands themselves in that way. And that's okay, because, mythology has always been a field of interest that is given to people who apprehend it in different ways. So, for example, look, age can be a determinant as to whether you understand mythology. In African societies, you'd sit around, let's say, a fire or the storytelling place, and you might tell the story of the hero who was swallowed, or the heroine who's swallowed by a beast. Now, if you're 3 or 4 or 5 years old, you're going to be excited because that's a pretty exciting story. There were no movies, there was no internet, no cell phones. And that's a pretty exciting story. The hero gets swallowed by a beast and figures out how to get out of the beast. But if you're, I don't know, 12 or 13 or 14 and just about, going through puberty, then and having to break away from your family somewhat or separate, you might hear the story of being swallowed by the beast and fighting your way out of it in a little different way. And if you are a parent now about to have your own child, you might hear the story of what it means to be swallowed by the beast and the expectations of the society around you, and trying to find your own way, even though you now have additional responsibilities. You might hear it in a really different way. And if you are approaching the end of your life and you listen to the story of being swallowed by the beast, but finding and fighting a way out, you might hear that story, same story. You might hear it in a really different way. So myth has always been stories that different people, based on their capacity and readiness and ability to look within themselves, hear the same story in different ways based on where they are in their life, what their interests are in their life. And so when I say that myth isn't for everybody, I simply mean that not everybody is at the stage of their life where the stories speak to them, or they want to allow the stories to speak to them, and that's okay. The truth of the matter is myth is all around us. It's in lots of different areas of where we live. When I say where we live, I mean how we live our lives. Myth is in the music, in the lyrics, and most interestingly, the one part of human life that everybody shares that has deep mythic underpinnings is when they dream. Everybody dreams. Those dreams are often fantastical dreams. All sorts of things happen. People fly, people are heroes and heroines, and people are chased by demons and monsters, and sometimes they're swallowed. Look, myth is a public dream. Dream is a private myth. So in that regard, even if you don't resonate to the stories as they're told outwardly, everyone resonates to that mythic realm whenever they fall asleep and dream.
Wow.
That was beautiful. I love that. That's a beautiful sentiment. That dreams are a private myth, and myths are public dreams. That is amazing.
Was that you who did you write that in your book, or was that Joseph Campbell?
It's certainly in the book, and it's a paraphrase of what Campbell, Jung, and Bastian, and many other. Yeah, so it's many people have expressed something similar to that.
And you are on board with the idea of the monomyth?
I think the monomyth, and let's say for your audience what a monomyth is. The monomyth is an idea that you can essentially reduce down to a very simple series of happenings or occurrences, any of the mythologies, and therefore you have a template which helps you understand mythology wherever it comes from. So basically the monomyth is there's a hero or a heroine who's at first living in an area that they're very familiar with. There is some type of a call to go on a quest or an adventure. Often the hero or heroine doesn't want to go on that quest or adventure Eventually they are forced to, and the first thing that happens in the process of that adventure is they meet with some type of ogre or demon or monster that is preventing them from getting from where they are to the realm of the adventure that they're going to have. In the process of that, meeting that monster, they are often going to battle. They have to figure out how to best that monster and get into the land that is the land of their quest or an adventure. Once they're in that land of the quest or adventure, all sorts of magical things happen. And yes, they face other trials and tribulations. Eventually, they win some victory. And then there's often a return journey where they then have to go back through all of the processes that they've been through early on, now hopefully keeping and retaining this gift, which they then bring back to the land that they began with, and in that way deliver this gift. It could be a gift of insight, it could be a gift of wisdom, it could even be a monetary gift, but they're going to deliver this gift to the land and the people from where they came. That's the monomyth. And that monomyth simply means that you can understand myths in lots of different, from lots of different cultures based on this very simple template. While I do think the monomyth is important, I think there are elements of the monomyth which are probably lacking. If anything, one of the ways the monomyth is lacking is that it's a pretty much a male-centric myth. And I think there is probably a female version of that monomyth, which is equally important, equally found in different cultures. And I know there are some women like Maria Tavares at Harvard University who has just come out with a book, The Hero with 1,001 Faces. And her idea there is that that additional face is the face of the feminine, and it's extremely important. So yes, I'm on board with the monomyth, but I also see the monomyth has some limitations because most of the people who have written, studied, and presented about the monomyth have been white men. And we all know how far that gets us. That leaves out both people of color, but more importantly, I think in this case, it leaves out the voices of women. And that's an important voice to have in any discussion of sacred wisdom.
Absolutely.
We appreciate that,
Right.
especially.
Nice. And the reason I asked is because, you know, the questions I'm going to lead us down to kind of have monomythic aspects to it. And even for me in a personal life, when I was younger and getting into myths and specifically Greek myth and everything, I read somewhere a very long time ago, I can't cite this source, I forgot, way long time ago, that like when you get a group of people together, you can almost always find like mythic characteristics in each of them, specifically pertaining to the Greek deities. You will always find the leader who will be the Zeus character. You'll always find, the, person who's running around very mercurial, the Hermes figure. You'll find the physical one will be like Mars. You'll find the maternal one will be like Demeter, on and on. I mean, what do you think about that? Because that's going to lead some of the questions in the future.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think that's true, first of all, but more importantly, that panoply of different deities is found throughout the world. A good place to look for it in Africa would be in the different orishas.
Mm-hmm.
And so you could go one by one and match all of the deities you spoke of with the various orishas. Why would that be? Well, I think the best answer to why that would be the case is because it is not that the deities are somehow forces outside of ourselves that we have to come to terms with, as is often the case when people think about mythology. But the fact of the matter is that myth came from people trying to understand the forces that were operating inside of them. And so, for example, we would say if we were looking inside of ourselves, not just the group, but inside of ourselves, We could find a part of ourselves which was Zeus and the leader. We could find a part of ourselves which was, the kind of mercurial kind of person, the trickster figure if it's Native American mythology. So that mythology, again, I said, mythology is a public myth. Dreams is private mythology. And so it is that we really, the stories come from understanding what's going on inside of ourselves. And as we project that out, then we project the personifications of those psychic forces inside of ourselves as the various deities, gods, and goddesses that you see in mythology. And that's why I think it's so powerful. Now, of course, individuals, each of us probably personifies a little bit more of one kind of energy or the other, but all of us have within us aspects of the entire array of deities that you would find in any of the mythic systems.
Excellent. And that kind of runs into another question that I just thought of on the top of my head. Do you think everybody is the hero of their own story? Or do you think, like a story, there are good guys and bad guys?
Well, when I hear you say that, the first thing I think of is Carl Jung, the famous Swiss psychologist. And Jung was to ask of his clients always, what is the myth you are living? And so in that regard, I think everyone is the hero and heroine of their own story. If you look at dreams, one way to look at a dream and to understand and analyze the dream is to place yourself in the center of the dream and see all the characters as various manifestations of who you are. So in that regard, I think it's always safe to consider myth from your own point of view, because that's what myth is there for. Myth is there as a roadmap for you as an individual to help you figure out what your journey is, your unique journey. That's why myth is a story that can be told to 10 people and you can have 10 different interpretations of what that story is, because you will resonate to the story in a way that's useful to you, just as your dream. Two people can have a similar dream, but it can have a very different meaning for each of them. So I really believe that maybe more so than just saying or asking the question, are you the hero of your own myth, so to speak? I think the better question is, how do you understand the myth that you're listening to, the myth that you're dreaming in terms of your own life, and how can you use it as a roadmap to help you on your life's journey? That's what myth is for. It's to really be there as a roadmap at all the different stages of your life to help you how to make those transitions, transformations in your life's journey.
Okay, well, you definitely jumped to the last question, which was going to be me asking, what is the myth that you're living? I don't know, maybe I want to save off on that because that's a great end.
Or even more relevant for all of us, how can we determine the myth that we are living?
Okay.
Yeah, that is a really great question. Well, one of the first places to start, and let me say this, I would always add to that question, what is the myth you're living? When I was in active clinical practice, I would also add, where are you in the mythic cycle? Because I think that's really important. We can say I'm living the myth of, this character or that character, but it's more important to understand where you are in the journey. If you're thinking in terms of the monomyth, what stage are you at? Are you at the stage where you're being called to have an adventure and you're a little scared? Are you at the stage where you've had an adventure and now you're wondering, how do I get back into the real world with whatever insights I've had? So all of those are different, and I think they require a different understanding of who we are. But if you're going to ask the question, how do you determine what myth you are living? That's where the idea of the monomyth comes in so valuable, because you don't have to say, I'm living the Greek myth of Demeter, or I'm living the African myth of Oshun, or I'm living the Chinese myth of Kuan Yin. All of those are simply ethnic inflections of a deeper truth. So I would say to people, what transition are you making right now? And it could be a simple transition. It could be the transition, again, from graduating from school to finding a job, from being single to being married, from being a married couple without children to having children. It could be a transition from wellness to dealing with an illness. What is the most important transition you're making in your life? Then the next question I would ask somebody is, what are the obstacles that stand in your way of making the transition the way you would most like to make it or feel you can make it? So if you're moving from school to a job, what's holding you back from reaching out and finding the job that you love the most, that you feel is going to be the best for you, even if it may not be making the most money? What's holding you back? And if you're moving from a place of wellness to dealing with an illness, what's holding you back from challenging and beating that illness and emerging from it even more whole? So that's the second question. What's holding you back? And the third question is, what's the inner resource that you need to draw on that will help you overcome whatever it is that's holding you back from making this transition the way you would like to make it? And the final question is, what would it be like for you to find what you need to overcome whatever it is that's holding you back? So, where are you? What are the obstacles in front of you? What are the tools internally that you need to bring forward in your life to meet those obstacles? And how would your life be different if you were able to successfully bring forth those tools to meet those obstacles? If you and when you answer those 4 questions, you then know what myth it is you're living. May not have a name, as I said, like the myth of Demeter or the myth of Thor or the myth of Oshun, but that's not important. What is important is for you to understand where you are on your own personal journey, and answering those questions will certainly help.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
So these 4 questions that you asked that really just seem to be personal challenges to each and every one of us. They're individual questions, but can we also, extrapolate to the group as well with these questions?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, that's the whole idea of myth. You can ask the questions individually, the same questions as a group. You can ask them to a 3-year-old. You can ask them to an 83-year-old. Same questions, maybe different answers, but they're the same questions, sure. So if we're talking about, us as a group in terms of African Americans, what are the answers to those 4 questions? And that is a very powerful way in which myth can heal, because by answering those questions, boy, you get a lot of insights into what it is that you need to do and how it is you want to live your life. Certainly, those are questions which, Martin King, for example, answered. Those are questions which anybody who stepped out to do on a protest, to hold up a Black Lives Matter banner, they have answered those questions either specifically or simply in their action. They have answered those questions. And that's what I think where we often say about myth. Myth is the tune you dance to even when you can't hear it playing. And that's what I think is so wonderful, is that a lot of times, most people you speak to are not going to say, well, I'm living this myth and I'm, acting out, doing this part of the myth. But yet, if you step back, you can see that what they're doing is living their lives in these mythic terms. And I think that's really wonderful.
Absolutely, sir. And the whole reason I asked that was to bring it to the cause of oppressed people. Now, say you cannot answer these questions clearly. You have no clue what you're doing, why you're doing it, and what your ultimate goal of freedom looks like. Well, if you cannot answer these four questions, you're basically living. How would you explain the person who cannot answer your questions?
Yeah, well, again, I think it's important to realize that just because you can't answer the questions intellectually doesn't mean you aren't answering them in terms of the way you are moved to live your life. So that's a really important question, a really important observation that not everybody can answer them intellectually. That doesn't matter. A person might simply feel moved to pick up a Black Lives Matter banner and go out on a protest, and they haven't really thought deeply about why they're doing it, other than the fact that they're just tired of seeing young Black men and women killed by the police. That's a good enough motivation. There might be a deeper meaning behind that, and that is the sense that, we as a community have been in the belly of the beast, and what it is that we need to do to draw on our own strengths to fight our way out of the belly of the beast. Yeah, you can see that in a larger context if that's the point of view you have, but not everybody can answer it in that way. Now, there are times, and this is really important to answer your question, there are times when people are faced with a call to adventure and they refuse the call. There are myths in which the hero or heroine, and there are African myths where the hero or heroine is faced with a call to adventure and they say, I'm not going to take the call, I'm going to stay where it's comfortable. Almost always those myths end in tragedy. And the message there is, if you are called, if you are moved, even if you don't have the intellectual, it's not written out in paper what you're doing, but if you feel the move or the calling to do something and you choose not to, that's probably the most tragic situation. And so the myths are really there to help us understand, if you feel the call and if you feel moved, then at least take the first step in the direction of that calling. You may not know all the steps you need to take beforehand, and that's why you may not know exactly what myths you're living or exactly what you're supposed to be doing. But the neat thing about mythology, and I can certainly say this has been true in my life, is I don't always know exactly where the path is leading, but I really trust that if I just take the first step and keep taking each step as though it's the first step, you're going to end up in the right direction. That's what myth is there to help us really believe in, is that we can always take the right step by simply taking the next step.
So as long as you're moving in the river, you're on track. Maybe.
That's what they say, as long as you don't try to hold back the river.
Right.
Awesome.
Look, let's end it on the question I had at the end. Since we are ending on the myth that we are all living, both individually and as a collective, has your myth, your personal life myth changed?
Oh, absolutely. Myth has to change. Myth has to change as you grow older, as you age, as you move from into the realm of the elders. Myth has to change with you. And if I was going to say where I was in my mythic cycle, my mythic journey, I'm at the point where the hero or heroine has got the gift. And the question is, if you're thinking in some of the traditional myths, let's think about it. They've got a pot of gold, and now they're trying to step out of the forest back into the real world. And the question is, will the gold stay gold or will it turn to dust? So I think if I was going to reflect on where I am in my own personal life, that's where I am. I'm trying to step out of the forest with whatever gifts I've gotten in my life and hold on to them in the real world.
Wow. All right. Well, I hope you can bring whatever you have with us to, the realm of the sun, to, the top of the world, out of the cave, out of the ocean, or out of the unconscious. And hopefully you'll also come back and talk to us, because I have a lot of little weird questions. I want to I'm still talking from a rational point of view. Like, I want to know how to manipulate the myths, so we're living myths in a way that is conscious, but I also know your time has come to go.
And we thank you so much. We're so grateful for the time that you've taken for us today. It's been a very enlightening interview. You have no idea. It's like we've been waiting to talk to you. So this is like, it's almost like a dream come true right now. So we appreciate your time so very much. And we will be taking a lot of the things that you've said, not only sharing it with our audiences, but with even smaller audiences that we have, like as we do book clubs and so forth. But thank you so much for your time. And if you think of anything else that you'd like to add, please feel free to email us.
I'll email you.
And any time that you can allocate for us in the future, we'd love to dive into this a little bit deeper. But thank you so very much.
Well, thank you, and let's do this, a similar conversation at another point in time, sometime soon.
Yes,
Okay.
sir. Have a great night. Oh, Rose. Yes, it's getting dark over there too, right?
Yeah. Thank you.
Both of you as well. Thank you very much. And I've got to jump on another meeting right now, so I'm going to leave. Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Good evening.